Good afternoon and welcome back, and thank you so much for attending. Now, this session of the Berlin Moot, we are doing in partnership with the United Nations, and I was very happy when they themselves suggested that the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs decided that we should choose the topic of human rights and mediation. This is, in fact, the subject of a book we published just under a year ago, and it's one that I think is of tremendous importance. And I would say it's particularly important because we are currently going through a very difficult stage for human rights. Because, as anyone who has worked in the human rights movement knows, almost the worst thing that can happen is the accusations of double standards and selectivity and hypocrisy. And particularly when those countries that are most seen to have been upholding human rights values and principles, often even while being criticized by other countries who do not really hold these values, that they were merely doing it to politicize and to undermine governments they didn't like. Now, when they therefore show double standards themselves, they slightly prove the point. And therefore, and I know from friends in the movement who are pretty downbeat at the moment. So this is a very important topic. There are, of course, many conflicts going on in the world, but perhaps sadly, only two of them are really the subject of headlines and chancelleries, Gaza and Ukraine, of course. And actually, almost every government in the world and how they react to those two conflicts slightly proves the point, and it's a bad point, that a war crime is only a war crime when it's committed by one of our enemies. And when it's committed by one of our friends, well, we don't really mind that much, and we certainly don't call it that. So we believe it is absolutely essential to consider human rights at a conference on peacemaking. And the two are inextricably linked. And for 25 years at the UN, I was working in either of the Department of Political Affairs or of the Human Rights. And now heading an organization on mediation in Berlin. Now, the two camps, mediators and human rights people, have a lot in common, which is a very good thing. Unfortunately, one thing they have in common is a mutual distrust of the other. And this can be, with each side, bristling as perhaps what they see as an arrogance and single focusedness of the other. I mean, human rights people, frankly, sometimes see mediators as being sort of rather cynical glory hunters, ready to do a quick fix that doesn't address root causes. And mediators see human rights defenders all too often as sanctimonious naïfs, lacking even minimal political judgment as they rush to condemn the main human rights violators, whose agreement, by the way, is of course essential to ending conflict. And as with all caricatures, there's an element of truth in these depictions, even if they are wildly exaggerated. And both sides really do need to be far more adept at seeing the argument of the other and to then refrain from criticizing them. And this, I think, would be deeply advantageous to the causes of both. So hence, one of the aims of this very distinguished panel is to help break that mutual antipathy and to build greater understanding and cooperation. Now, part of the problem, though, is that human rights as a field of activities covers a lot more than criminal accountability. However, the resources from Western countries recently seem to be overwhelmingly focused on prosecuting war criminals. Now, I'm not for a second saying there shouldn't be a major emphasis on accountability. I passionately believe that there should. But there is also a definite case to be made, as indeed Professor Philip Alston of New York University has recently done very eloquently, that there may be an excessive emphasis on prosecutions at the moment at the expense of all other human rights violations and indeed other human rights mechanisms. And these other human rights also contribute very much to conflict, particularly sometimes social and economic rights violations, which lead people to feeling marginalized and excluded. In any case, this panel is, for the reasons I've said, an exceptionally important one for our whole Berlin Moot today, which is why I'm exceptionally grateful to Anya and the very distinguished panelists that we brought together, who I'm looking forward to hearing very much what they have to say on this. So thank you very much, Anya.
Okay. Well, thank you, Andrew, for the kind introduction. Thank you very much for the mic. My name is Anja Wehler-Schöck. I'm the international editor at the Berlin-based newspaper Tagesspiegel. I'm very happy to moderate this panel here today. As Andrew already mentioned, the concepts of human rights and mediation are very closely linked and depend on each other for success. And in a time like this, with growing polarization worldwide, with increasing conflict, it's become more and more important to identify common ground, and that's what we're here to do today with the exceptional panel here. We would like to look at the practice of mediation and how it can be improved through human rights, and all four speakers are extremely experienced in mediation and will share their insights from their work around the globe. So to our very right is Meredith Preston McGee, and she's the Secretary General of the Global Center for Pluralism based in Ottawa. And she has extensive experience with a broad range of mediation processes, including with the United Nations and the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. She's worked in Africa for more than 20 years and helped establish and facilitate peace processes, for example, in Nigeria, Somalia, Sudan, and South Sudan. Barney Afako is a member of the Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan and has also a long experience in mediation efforts, including with the United Nations. He was a member of the UN standby team of senior mediation advisors, and he has worked on different conflicts, for example, in Yemen, Afghanistan, Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, the Horn of Africa, and the Western Balkans. Welcome, Barney. In the middle is Eamon Gilmore. He has just completed a 5-year term as the EU Special Representative for Human Rights and an 8-year mandate as the EU Special Envoy for the peace process in Colombia. And he's the former Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade of Ireland. And in this capacity, he also served as the co-guarantor of the Northern Ireland peace process. And he was the leader of the Irish Labour Party and a trade union leader, and of course has extensive mediation experience. And he's not related to Andrew. To my right is Cha-Yui Liu. He's an assistant professor at the School of International Studies in Beijing at Beijing University, and he's founding director of Peace Lab, an institution promoting conflict and peace studies in China. And before that, he was a research fellow at the Strategic and Defense Studies Center at the Australian National University. And in his research, he focuses on conflict and peace, and he has field experience in Ukraine, Syria, Lebanon, Myanmar, and Colombia, and much more. So warm welcome to our panelists. Meredith, I want to start off with you. Andrew already mentioned the discussion around double standards that we see today. Is there such a thing as universal human rights, or rather, can we speak of a universal application of human rights today?
Well, thank you. Is this on? You can hear me. Great. Thank you. I knew you were going to start with the hardest question there, and I think it is important as we sort of open this up to think a little bit about some of the tensions that exist. And I have to say, I was smiling in Andrew's introduction about what mediators think of human rights folks and what human rights folks think of mediators, when several people on this panel, who will remain nameless, might see themselves as both of those things. And I think that we actually do see both of those things sort of coexisting. I think to the question of universal application and the universality, I think we are living in a time when universality as a concept is really coming under threat, and I think it's really important that we acknowledge that. It doesn't necessarily mean that the rights that we all believe so deeply to be true are not indeed universal in their spirit, but how these have been applied and the perceptions of these in all of the conflicts that I've worked in are deeply complex. And I think sometimes we can get caught up in the idea of universality, meaning everything has to be the same. And we start to be a little bit tone deaf to the recognition that these things are playing out very, very differently in every society. And you know, as we were speaking earlier on several of the different conflicts that a lot of us have worked on, I think one of the features where I have seen things really take root when you want to talk about issues of human rights within a mediation process is when they're deeply rooted in the reality and the application of the society and the conflict and the situation that it's in. And I know we'll come to the wider question of the universal frameworks and how that can help or hinder, but I think there really is something to be said for what it actually means for the society to have built a tradition around calling for human rights or democracy in whatever form they've done. I spent many years working in Kenya, and you looked at the push for multi-party democracy and the push for civic rights there were really at the core of how you were able to build human rights standards that were at the center of the agreement in 2008, but that very much came from the Kenyan people. So I think one of the first points that I really wanted to make was how can we be a bit more nuanced and sophisticated about meeting societies where they sit and not necessarily bringing the universality down, but actually starting to look at these pieces from the ground up. And in so doing, I think we can acknowledge that these norms are not being universally applied and that they are being selectively applied. And that's a problem. And that's a problem that we have to deal with globally, and we had to deal with in the opening panel today, and I think we'll continue to do so in this forum.
Barney, coming to you, you shared before when we spoke that for you, the tie between human rights and mediation has a highly personal note because it's also closely tied to your growing up, your professional biography. Can you share with us how you came to be a mediator?
I'm from Uganda, and I grew up during the time of a dictatorship, very closely followed by several civil wars. So when I went to law school, because of my political disposition, I was inclined towards human rights. And human rights because I could see the objective conditions in the country needed interventions and needed an accentuation of the rights, not just of individuals, but more principally of groups of society. And I then became a human rights lawyer, and one summer I was practicing in London. Then I was asked by African Rights to go to, which is a human rights organization then, to go to northern Uganda, my own country, and to look into the human rights situation there, particularly focusing on questions of justice and access to justice. And that trip really changed me as a human rights practitioner, because I came to see that the situation of deprivation of rights was directly linked to a conflict about which the government wasn't doing much, except throwing offensive after offensive at rebel groups and having victory eluding them by that time for a decade. So I came to the conclusion that to do human rights, you had to do conflict resolution. It wasn't because of the violations, direct violations in the context of a conflict. It was because mothers were bearing babies and toddlers on a weekly basis. It was because hundreds of thousands of people were displaced, living in camps, and their whole social existence, their whole culture, their whole livelihoods had been disrupted. They were not enjoying human rights. So I came to see that unless you did conflict resolution, you'd not be effective in human rights. So I started to do both. I won't say I switched. For me, human rights then became the impetus for conflict resolution and mediation. And so when I became a member of the standby team, I was very pleased that they asked me to start also looking at this question of human rights and mediation. And you'll see that DPPA last year, in conjunction with OHCHR, produced a practice note on human rights and mediation. And that's really to rediscover what's in the Charter, which pits conflict resolution, the peacemaking, with justice, as we're hearing earlier, and with the vindication of rights. So we are rediscovering something that the drafters of the Charter actually embedded into the purposes of the UN all those years ago. So for me, there is no, I don't have a double hat, I have a single hat, and that my practice makes sure that the conditions of communities, of individuals are improved through peacemaking. And I think that we need to go back to that single-heartedness so that there isn't this artificial caricature between rights and mediation. I see mediation as a tool. I don't see human rights as a tool. I see mediation as the tool for achieving the fulfillment and respect and protection of rights in concrete situations.
Actually, in the UN practice guide that you mentioned, there's a very beautiful quote, peace without respect for human rights is incomplete. And I think that very much transports what you just said. Eamon, I wanted to turn to you. As I said, you served as human rights envoy for the European Union, but its 27 members don't always see eye to eye on issues. It's become quite apparent during the war in the Middle East that there is some dissent. Describe some of the challenges for us that you faced as being the human rights envoy for 27 countries that don't always agree on everything.
Well, the remarkable thing is that, in fact, the 27 do agree on so many things. And one of the things that we got agreement on a number of years ago was on an action plan on human rights and democracy in the world, which was agreed unanimously by all of the 27 member states. I think one of the difficulties that the European Union has structurally is that in the foreign policy area, we require unanimity. It's not just a case of voting. All 27 have to agree. So that's why on issues like, for example, on the situation in Israel and Gaza, we do not have unanimity. But I think on the human rights issue, that there is unanimity on the core principles. I think when we're talking about human rights, I think there's a tendency very often to talk very legalistic and very jargonistic terms, and conventions and so on. I think we have to keep this relatively simple. I mean, when we talk about universality of human rights, what we really mean is that human rights belong to people. And they belong to people everywhere, and they belong to individual people. They're not the property of states or of institutions. And it's a constant battle to win that. And in the work that I did as a special representative for human rights, I remember very often telling the story about what happened on this continent, where we came from in the first half of the 20th century to where we are now, and that it was a journey. I tell the story, for example, I was a member of the National Parliament in Ireland when we abolished the death penalty. Mm-hmm. It was in the middle of the conflict in Northern Ireland when the IRA was still killing unarmed police officers. I was involved in the campaign for marriage equality, the right of same-sex couples to marry. But I was also a member of the Parliament which decriminalised homosexuality. It was only 30 years ago. So it's a journey, and it's a battle all of the time to try. And sometimes the change comes slowly, and we have to exercise a degree of patience with that, I think.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Liu, you're from China, a country that's often confronted with massive human rights violations by the international community. How has this shaped your experience working in this field?
Right. For me, that I went into conflict zones as a researcher at the very beginning, and then regardless of which conflict I went into, people always ask me about China's role in mediating this crisis. So in a way that I found this distorted imagination about China's role in mediating every international conflict. I would not really call my approach to conflict mediation as a human rights informed one, because the discussion on human rights discourse or rhetoric has not really resonated that much with the mediation community within China, frankly speaking. But I do find that there are probably some kind of very misleading narratives about, China, international conflict, and human rights. The first one is that it seems to be that China will avoid any kind of engagement on human rights discourse. So in a way, China is imagined as a kind of moral vacuum almost, and to be very detached from the human rights discussion. The second narrative is that China has its own human rights rhetoric, which is the right to development or developmental peace, which seems to be going to replace the liberal peace-building approach. I think both these narratives in my work are very misleading, because first of all, you can almost find China's constant reference to human rights, probably not in the same sense as the Western government or civil society would call it. Secondly, that in the very original discussion on the developmental peace or right to development, either the Chinese researchers or the Chinese government always say and emphasize this is a supplement to the existing peace models. This is not going to replace the currently existing model. But for some reason, when that term that came into the international discussion, it was seen as a contesting the current existing model. So I would say that probably from my work that I can say that the Chinese mediators community and broadly defined the Chinese actors in conflict zones are fully aware there are multiple layers of different meanings of human rights, both locally and also internationally. And China would choose a relatively cautious and pragmatic approach towards it. If there is a local conflict party who would like to incorporate human rights framework into the mediation sessions China is sharing, I don't think China will raise any objection to that. But I don't think China will actively bring in any human rights agenda into the crisis that it will try to mediate.
One point where I see this as very relevant in conflict mediation is the role of marginalized communities, which is also a criticism that's often voiced towards China. How has this played a role in your work? I've listed some of the places where you've worked in Syria, for example. How have you in your work guaranteed that marginalized groups have played a role in conflict mediation?
Right. So, in in mediation sessions that we try to organize, either based in Beijing or based in some local places, we always try to reach out to as many groups as we can, even those groups who might have a different view in terms of their political stance towards China. So in Syria, for example, we try to invite almost all the opposition groups into the negotiation table, including those groups that still have some of the Chinese transnational fighters within them. But they also agree to be on the negotiation table. So I think that although there is kind of different views on China's domestic human rights policies, but at the mediation sessions which I organized or participated, I did not see there is a clear resistance or objection to include as many groups as we can in the local sense. Some of them might refuse to come over because they believe that China's led mediation session might be biased. This is true in some of the cases, which I cannot name openly right now because still ongoing processes. But I think by sending out invitations, we demonstrate that we are not trying to exclude any groups from this process. But based on their previous established views of China, they might choose come or not, which we respect as well.
Meredith, I wanted to come back to you. Your experience in Kenya, for example, the question of inclusivity and including marginalized groups. Which tools have proven most effective from your point of view?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that I think one of the reasons why inclusion is important in these spaces is that this is often how core issues of human rights find their way onto agendas within these spaces. And I know, Eamon, you were mentioning that on Colombia when we were speaking earlier. And so from the Kenyan perspective and on that process in 2008, we were really fortunate, as I referenced, to have a really phenomenal and incredibly robust civil society that was really, really engaged early on, both documenting human rights abuses, but also speaking out in that space. But a couple of pieces to kind of connect that in terms of how some of that ended up on the agenda. One of the things that happened really early on was that the mediation team used inclusion as a strategic lever to create a relationship between the mediation panel and the people of Kenya. So when Mr. Annan and the panel first arrived, there was a couple of meetings with the leaders, as there should be, but then they went and they spoke to the people of Kenya. And it was about 4 days of meetings, which sounds like not very long, but this was a 41-day-long mediation. So 4 days was long in this particular context, and spent time listening to a huge cross-section of marginalized communities, of women, of youth, of other political parties, of traditional leaders, business community, and so forth. And what that enabled the mediation to do when they were in the political process with the parties, and the parties would say, this is only a political issue. They weren't just pushing back from a human rights perspective as an external mediator. They were saying, that's not what your people have told us. What your people have told us is this, and this is what we've heard. And so it created a different dynamic to bring some of these issues into the table that wasn't an external imposition of issues that were really at the core to the reasons why the conflict had emerged in the first place, but they had really come up from the people of Kenya themselves and had built that relationship so there was ongoing dialogue with the mediation team throughout. And so I think when we think about inclusion, it's often seen as a nice to have, and it's often seen as numbers and bodies around a table, rather than recognition that it fundamentally, if done right, can actually change the dynamics of how you're even understanding the conflict you're trying to resolve. And if you are concerned about the elite bargains that aren't necessarily going to address the fundamental root causes of a conflict, which are at their roots about the rights of the people, the universal rights of the people in that society, you need to shift the dynamics of how that table itself is designed. And that isn't pulling up a folding chair to the corner and offering it to a woman. It's really thinking about what is the situation of marginalization in this space and how do we understand that? So it isn't also just, if you are going to be including women in the capital who speak English, for example, but really saying, what do we understand about how people have been marginalized as a result of this conflict and how are we finding ways to include them? And I think for me, that very much is at the core of how you have a human rights approach to mediation.
Barney?
And I wanted to build on what you're saying, Meredith, because time and again I encounter human rights work being done in a language that really sounds alien to the communities and societies in which either mediators or human rights actors indeed are operating, because the language of human rights is often citing conventions, citing rules, citing laws. But I think as mediators, we need to drill down to the values that underpin human rights, and this concept of the dignity of human beings that we forget about, that there isn't a particular treaty on that defines. But in every culture and society, you can find concepts of what dignity means. I find that those conversations get us much further than simply a set of rules. I'll give you an example on South Sudan. 90% of the adjudication of any issue, more than 90%, doesn't happen in the formal courts, happens in the traditional courts. And we were in a peace process. I was in helping with the mediation before I switched to more direct human rights work. And we got to this discussion about justice. And we wanted to introduce language which said that traditional institutions of adjudication would align their work with the Constitution so that it is compliant with the notion of rights. Now, it is civil society actors who shot down the proposal on the basis that it wasn't in line with their understanding of what a rights implementing body should look like. They'd not considered traditional institutions as contributing to the dignity of the communities. And so we have to be careful also in the way we conceptualize and interpret rights in different communities. Sometimes the answers are already there. And the role of the mediator, indeed the human rights actor, is to discover what resonates with the principles and values of human rights.
Mm. Eamon, in your work for the EU, both as a representative on human rights, but also as an envoy for Colombia, what was your experience in translating human rights to fit the local context?
Well, the Colombia conflict between FARC and the Colombian state lasted for 53 years. It was one of the longest and bloodiest in the world. 250,000 people were killed, 100,000 people were missing, and 6 million people were displaced. And it was brought to an end in 2016 by the agreement that was concluded in Havana, in Cuba. But there had been attempts for more than 30 years to negotiate a peace agreement. And what made the 2016 agreement successful, I think, there were many things, but one of them was that it addressed human rights issues. Mm-hmm. In the causes of the conflict, it addressed the social and economic rights issues about land reform. And an entire chapter of the agreement was on land reform. On the conduct of the conflict, it addressed the needs of victims. It brought the victims to the table. It had women at the table, an essential element, I think, of any peace negotiation. it developed a victim-centered system of transitional justice, which actually, incidentally, was quite criticized by some people in the human rights community when it was initially negotiated. But I think now everybody accepts that actually it's somewhat of a model for transitional justice and for accountability. So it had those elements which I think drew on human rights, made it part of the agreement, and it is now. It's still very much a work in progress. There are still difficulties in implementation, but the difference, I think, between its success and the previous failures, one of the differences was the fact that it addressed the human rights causes and reflected them in the ultimate agreement.
Looking at Colombia for a little while, what does this process teach us about follow-through? Because when we look at Colombia right now, we see increasing tension with other actors, violent actors, increase in drug trafficking. What can we learn from this case about follow-through?
I think that one of the things that can be learned from the Colombian agreement is the necessity for implementation. And I think perhaps looking back at the negotiation process, perhaps there wasn't enough attention given to how it was going to be implemented. So, for example, when FARC left the areas that they effectively controlled, the intention was that the state would take over control. That didn't happen. And a vacuum emerged where other armed actors took control. Secondly, the promise of the agreement on dealing with the issue of illegal drugs did not really effectively get implemented. So what you've ended up with, in fact, there's 3 times the amount of coca production in Colombia today as there was at the time that the agreement was signed. But that's not, and I think this is again something where, again, the international community, I think, has a role to play. You can't look at Colombia and say you've got to solve the drugs problem. If Colombia is producing 70% of the cocaine in the world, I think there is a responsibility on the demand side in Europe, in North America, to do what is necessary to deal with the drugs issue, and that's a big debate. But it cannot be dealt with by simply spraying the crop in poor parts of Colombia and leaving people, growers, farmers, to the mercy of what are criminal gangs in remote parts of the country.
Lou, I wanted to turn to you. You've worked in Syria for several times, and it's a conflict that has been going on since 2011, and there's no end in sight. What obstacles did you face in your work on the ground, and what lessons did you draw from them?
Too many. And Syria, I visited 3 times since 2018, I think. Last time I was there was the end of 2022. And ironically, when the major conflict stopped since 2018, when it was in 2019 when I was in Syria, there was this very hopeful stage when people think, okay, we're coming towards the end of the conflict. There will be a process of reconstruction. We're becoming more like Iraq nowadays, back then. But then towards the end of 2022, early 2023, when I visited there, there's shortage of everything. And most of the young people that I knew back then all left the country. So there's definitely less hope there now in terms of the reconstruction. And also the social environment, the general sentiment all changed. So I think this is not only like a challenge for international mediators, this is like a more general challenge for all the community working in humanitarian assistance and also the peace building processes in Syria. I personally think, this might be controversial to say this in Europe, but my experience that in Syria that really make me realize that isolation or sanction will not really work. Because I'll give you a very easy example. When I was there at the end of 2022 in Damascus and also in Aleppo, there was this Christmas market set up in the city center in Syria, inspired by the European Christmas market and launched by the First Lady. And the entry ticket is about $5, I think, which is the living cost of a family for a whole month in Syria. But you go in, there will be, Syrian people that are celebrating, like they're celebrating here in the Christmas market, and all the settings are so similar. And there will be my Syrian friend pointing to the group of the people buying the drinks there. He said, "Look, those are the new rich people who made their money out of the sanction." because of the sanction that there will be a new group of people doing, economic exchanges and also trade through different networks, through smuggling. The people that you want to punish with the international sanction, to be fair, was not really impacted by the sanction. And then there will be a kind of enlarged social inequalities within the country. And in the end, it is the ordinary people who suffer, who cannot leave the country, who do not have other means of maneuvering around the sanction system. And I think that similar stories can be told in Afghanistan and previously maybe in Iraq. So my sense in terms of the difficulty that I face in Syria is that to really solve the really basic, like a daily livings of the ordinary people, that if keep imposing sanctions on the regime will not change the regime, but it will turn against the ordinary people living there. And that will be the everyday difficulty which I face. If any kind of mediation session we try to bring on Syria, the first question is that, do you have any means of, give us food or medicine, all those kind of basic needs we kind of need on an everyday basis. Those are the questions that we as mediators cannot solve. So I think that will need a much larger international coordination to really respond to that. I mean, some of the UN fact-finding missions have already discovered that issue in Syria, but I don't think that will increase enough leverage for the international community to change its current policy, economic-wise, towards Syria.
But how much room does this leave for, to mediate between the different factions? If we're now seeing a normalization of Bashar al-Assad with the regime being welcomed back into the Arab League and the conflict being sort of normalized, how much room does this leave to make sure that those who stood up against the regime are being taken into account and being safeguarded?
To be honestly speaking, I think that largely depends on the relationship between Syria and Turkey and potentially some of the Russian involvement in the region. If Turkey still has its backing on the opposition groups, then the opposition groups still have a leverage in negotiating with Assad in terms of the peace deal or potential, you may say, transitional period. But I don't think that lifting the sanction or giving Syrian economy, the ordinary people, like some room to breathe, will necessarily strengthen the regime to the extent that the opposition groups cannot negotiate with the regime anymore. Personal judgment. I cannot be responsible for that.
Yeah, I'd just like to take up the point in relation to sanctions, because I agree with you that where you have generalized sanctions that apply against a country or against a population, you get the kind of result that you're describing. The European Union, in its approach to sanctions, is different in that it identifies individuals or entities on whom the sanctions are placed rather than on general populations. But I think there's a broader question here, which is we're now living in a world where it is increasingly the case that might appears to be right. Country invades a neighbour. A country takes an attack on a piece of occupied territory and kills 30,000 people. What happens when a country does not comply with international law? And we have a number of difficulties. We set up an international criminal court after Rwanda and what happened in the Balkans to address war crimes. 45 states in the world, including two of the biggest and three of the biggest actually, and 3 permanent members of the Security Council, have not ratified the Rome Statute and are not a party to that court. We had the International Court of Justice making a judgment in relation to Israel and Gaza, which is not being complied with. So what are we to do if judgments of international courts are not complied with? If states do not join the international court system that's established to deal with it. And sanctions is one of the tools that we have to deal. Now, how they're used, that is certainly a question. It's not the ideal way. The better way is that states take their responsibility seriously, are part of the international justice system and join the relevant court bodies that have a role in relation to these matters.
Barney, you've worked in Afghanistan for a little while. I wanted to base a question on your experience there. I think Eamon said before, if you negotiate, you have to, or if you are in the mediation business, you have to talk to people who aren't nice. What are the conditions to start a mediation process? And based on your experience in Afghanistan, should we be speaking to the Taliban and see if there can be a mediation started in the country?
I think I'll start by being a bit pedantic and say I've worked on, but not in Afghanistan.
Okay, we'll take that.
I did support the UN mission in Afghanistan during the Doha talks, and in fact I left just when things were collapsing in Kabul. But more recently, I was in Kabul for the first time last year, and it was to talk with the UN mission there about exactly these kinds of issues and thinking about confidence building imaginatively because of the strange relationships not only within Afghan society but between the de facto authorities, the Taliban, and the international community. So starting to see the UN as making efforts to bridge those divides. But as you'll know, there was also an independent assessment that was mandated by the Security Council, and the report is out. And it seeks to be forward-looking in trying to change the status quo towards a sort of incremental benchmark-based restoration of relations. And it's got elements in there, but one of the elements is to promote Afghan dialogue among Afghans themselves. And I think that there is no dissent, I believed, on the necessity of getting the Afghans to begin to talk about what is happening to their country now. There are different voices as to when and how, what should be on the agenda. But I think that we're moving towards a place where we will begin to see efforts to catalyze exactly that kind of dialogue taking shape, but starting among Afghan society. Because a lot of things are happening in Afghanistan. Yes, there are violations, and it's right that the international community resists those. And in fact, the independent assessment makes the normalization, if that's not too big a word, of relations contingent on changes. But one of the lessons from human rights that we often forget is this idea of progressive realization. It's often of rights. It's often used in terms of social and economic rights, but it's also about realism as to how much progress you will make with an interlocutor and what tools you use to persuade an interlocutor that it's in their interest and the interests of the society that they should change their conduct and more consistently protect and respect the dignity of citizens. So I think there will be opportunities. It will be difficult. I don't think we're yet anywhere near a time when you can have convenings of formal talks. But I think that dialogue, it's right that dialogue should start in situ and among Afghans within Afghanistan and incrementally take on board other participants.
Meredith, you mentioned before that the approach should be nuanced and human rights should not be hammered in. How can this look like in a context like Afghanistan, where half of the population is excluded? In your opinion, what trade-offs need to be made, and what are the red lines?
Well, like Barney, I've worked on, but not in Afghanistan, so I'm going to temper my sort of context-specific notes, but to say that trade-offs do have to be made, and I think we need to, as mediators, recognize that the rights and dignity, and I think, Barney, I really liked your framing of dignity of persons as the sort of the North Star, because that is where peace is realized. In the work that I do now with the Global Center for Pluralism, when we look at diversity, we'd look at this room, we're all diverse, but there is something that connects everybody, and it is this desire for dignity, for belonging, for respect and recognition. And it's extraordinary how universal these basic conditions of humanity are, and they manifest themselves differently everywhere, but they really are at the heart of successful societies. And so if that's where you're trying to get the society to, I think it's really important as a mediator to really temper your own trade-offs. There's always a desire to make a quick win. There's always a desire to stop the war. There's a desire in Sudan right now to end the fighting. There's a desire to make those stops. But you do have to think about at what cost are you making an immediate deal when you think about that longer-term goal of the dignity, respect, belonging and recognition of all of the citizens of that space, and how are you trying to get there? It's going to look different in every place, but you have to think really carefully about some of those trade-offs. I have to say also, you know, in these, the remarks that both of you made on sanctions, I think something else that we also have to recognize in the wider question of the human rights frameworks globally, questions of accountability and so forth, and you referenced both Ukraine and Israel, Gaza, but when you think about many of the other conflicts going on, there are other external actors involved that aren't even as overt, although it's well known, but as overt as the cases that you mentioned. And it's, again, even more of a challenge to think about how you think about accountability when you have, maybe it's weapons transfers and weapons sales, maybe it's other forms of support, but you have a much wider space. I was discussing with some Yemeni women peace builders last year, and we were talking about inclusion and human rights in their own process. And one of the things that they said is that what is so difficult is the conflict isn't about them. The conflict is happening to them, but a lot of the resolution discussions are not even just happening outside of Yemen, they're not happening with Yemenis, that there's other things afoot. And when you bring it up to those levels, when we have a system that is as polarized as it is right now, we're really in a lot of trouble there. But I think as mediators, our North Star has to remain this core universal humanity of people. And that is rights-based, but I'm also conscious that in today's parlance, often starting by saying human rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is where I'm starting. From a pluralist perspective, we also often look at meeting a society where it's at and sitting with them in terms of the local contextualization that all of you have talked about, and trying to understand that from the ground up. And those core pieces will be there. They'll be called something different, and the path to get there will be different, but we have to start by understanding that society where it's at.
Mm-hmm. Meredith, to stay with you, you mentioned before that you're working on intra-Palestinian mediation, and I went, no? Okay, well, then.
No, we have a, just to clarify, we confer a Global Pluralism Award every 2 years, and our awardee last year, Reform, is an organization that works on intra-Palestinian dialogue.
Okay, well, apologies for the misunderstanding, but let's say in the Middle East, when you look back on your experience as a mediator, what's the toolkit that you would advise for a mediator now trying to bring peace in the Middle East?
You started asking me about the universality of human rights, and you've now asked me to bring peace to the Middle East. I feel like I'm getting the toughest questions up here. I mean, I think there's so many different ways to address that, and I think what we really have to look at right now, again, to this point earlier of the trade-offs that need to be made, is how do you create conditions now that stem the worst excesses from blocking the ability to do anything in future. And I think, I mean, from those of us who are observing, I'm an observer on the situation in Israel, Gaza, is this fear that it has gotten so bad, how could you ever come back to something that would enable some sort of space? And I know people that are much wiser than me that are doing an enormous amount of work on this. I personally have been really inspired by movements like A Land for All that are really trying to think about the long-term future of how you would build something that is pluralist in nature. But it's incredibly hard. And I think that the human rights core questions will remain for a long time. But again, it's not an area that I'm deeply steeped in, so I'm going to restrict my comments.
Barney, looking at the largest conflict that we see at the moment in Sudan, it's often not in the center of the international discussion, which is dominated by Ukraine and the Middle East. What has your experience been like on Sudan? Why is this conflict erupting again after manifold mediation efforts?
And there are probably a lot of people who are better qualified to answer that than I am. But we need to look at the history of Sudan right from its independence. It's never really been at peace with itself. In 2009, President Beki and some of his other colleagues were appointed by the African Union to go to Darfur to analyze a conflict then which was very much in the consciousness of the world. And indeed, international justice and President Bashir had been indicted to find out what the problems were and what the solutions might be. And what that panel did, the AU panel on Darfur, was to define the problem in Darfur as really a Sudanese challenge, that there'd been a difficulty in managing diversity, managing pluralism in that country. It had led eventually to the secession of the South. But unless that question was addressed, that identity was not a basis for marginalization, and that all Sudanese could express themselves and have equal citizenship, then the country would be would not find stability. And I think that core challenge of state and nation has not been addressed. And I think we're seeing these reversals because the peace processes haven't managed to find an answer, to find a formula for an inclusive polity in Sudan. And so we need to discover the steps, the people who should be around the table to move Sudan from these cycles of violence, which are really based, I believe, on the central governance problem. And of course, as with all of its conflicts, a lot of violations of individual rights, and those are important to deal with. But it's the politics of it, I think, that we need to find a formula for addressing.
Speaking of politics, Ayman, we started out the discussion by asking a question: how the field of human rights and conflict mediation could be brought closer together. What strategies need to be employed to make sure that these two are closely interlinked and when addressing conflicts?
Well, I think in addressing conflicts, one always has to look at the causes of the conflict, and I think that the biggest quality I think that mediators need is an ability to listen, and sometimes to listen afresh, and to look at where one looks at the causes of any conflict, you will find human rights violations and abuses at the core of those. So I think identifying those, I think, is important. I was struck this morning, I think in the opening panel, by a comment that was made by one of the panelists about the degree to which the world is becoming militarized and the increasing emphasis on defense spending. And, here in Europe, every country is now encouraged to get to the 2% of GDP on defense spending. But I think one of the questions I think that we have to ask ourselves is how much of that is devoted to peace building. And I think one concrete suggestion that I would like to make is that perhaps we should look at defining a proportion of GDP which is defined for peace building. We have, for example, in the European Union, it's called the European Peace Facility. It's the off-budget mechanism that is used to fund the weapons and armaments, and it's largely going to Ukraine. It's very necessary. I don't dispute it, but I think we need to have dedicated funding for peace building. And the other point I would make is the derogatory way sometimes in which, the alternative to war is talking, And yet we speak in a very derogatory way about talking shops. I think we should have an objective. Let's replace every battlefield with a talking shop. It kills less people, it gets more results.
Before we open the thank you. Before we open the discussion for the audience, Lou, you've been to Ukraine. You've been involved in mediation efforts there. What lessons can you draw so far, and what perspectives do you see?
It's another difficult case. I mean, on Ukraine, that we mainly work on the track 2 between China and the Ukrainian actors. And I think what struck me the most is that the Ukrainian actors are actually much less aggressive in their rhetoric towards Chinese actors in comparison to the EU counterpart. They seem to have a very realistic assessment about China's policy towards the Ukrainian-Russian war. And I think that they deliver their lines very clearly, saying that as long as there's no arms sales to Russia, and China has a very clear nuclear policy, that Ukraine will, in a way, continue to develop this kind of normalization relationship with China, either during the war or after the war. So this, in a way, also struck me in terms of that when the direct dialogue channels being established among the different stakeholders, and like the talking shops, you may say, or like this kind of like the tones of the conversation is actually quite calm. It's not as aggressive as I would imagine it to be. Throughout my kind of visit last year in Ukraine, I was a little bit worried at the very beginning because I know there's a public resentment against China, perceiving China as a pro-Russia actor. But I have to say that I was received really well in Ukraine, both by the public and also by the policy community. So I think that for me, the Ukrainian experience is mainly about having these direct channels being established. And also that it's also in a way that make me believe that mediation, I prefer a very narrowly defined mediation, you may say toolbox. I think mediation is best in achieving negative peace. We cannot expect mediation to achieve, long-term sustainable peace solutions to the local conflict in long term. I think mediation, that we can have that in the backstage, in the back of our head, but I think mediation should be about the possibility to talk to everybody with regard to the conflict and bring about negative peace in short term to stop the losses of the human lives. So that would be my kind of key take from the Ukrainian.
So do you see a way to direct dialogue between Ukraine and the aggressor Russia?
Yes, when there are consensus being established on both sides to negotiate. And I'm afraid at this very moment, I think either side have a very different understanding in terms of what they want to achieve in this war. So I think all the actors, including China, realize that unless the both sides have shown enough willingness to engage in negotiation, the internal actors, the external actors can engage and also support that process. But I'm afraid that at this very stage, there's a big perception gaps from both sides in terms of what they want to achieve in negotiation.
Okay, but from the side of the country that has been the victim of an aggression, it is difficult to ask to make these kinds of concessions towards the aggressor, right?
Yeah, so I think that I agree with many of my European colleagues. I think the decision to negotiation should be left to the Ukrainian government and also to the Ukrainian public to what extent they want to step in. And I don't think that currently any kind of territorial compromises or concession are on the table.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you. With that, I would like to open the floor for questions from the audience. If you're interested, I see the gentleman in the front. Please raise your hand. Thank you. And someone with a microphone will come. The gentleman in the front was first. And please briefly state your name and your affiliation, and then ask a question.
Thank you so much. My name is El Gassim Wan. I was the head of MINUSMA in Mali until December, when the mission pulled out. I just wanted, in fact, question, but more of an observation on the issue of human rights I just wanted to replace mediation by peacekeeping and to explain a bit the challenges the MINUSMA was faced with in the context of Mali in implementing its human rights mandate, which is part and parcel of the mandate. And the difficulty was that with the global polarization and the arrival of new partners in Mali, obviously the authorities restricted our ability to perform that mandate. We hardly received authorization to conduct in situ investigations. Most of our investigations were done remotely, and every report we issued was challenged openly by the Malian authorities. On the other hand, for a host of other reasons, there was also pressure from members of the council for us to aggressively pursue the mandate. And of course, our mandate is not only about investigating, documenting, and reporting, it's also about building capacity. But that did not attract a lot of attention, not from the press, obviously, not from member states. And people were more interested in the reporting part. Why? Because, of course, the reporting part can also play in the discussions in the Security Council as the P3, on the one hand, Russia.
Can you ask your questions? We have a couple of others.
And others, battle around Mali. And it made our task extremely difficult because our mandate is not only about human rights, it also involves a number of other equally important issues. And the recommendation I would like to make, based on my own experience in Mali, but also my past experience at the AU, is to make sure that human rights is not just seen as a concern by the West. I think that plays absolutely against the agenda of furthering human rights, because it is so easy in the current context where social media is pervasive, disinformation, misinformation, to frame every single intervention by the West as literally driven by other agendas. Obviously, there are other agendas. And one way of doing it, in my view, in the African context, is to make sure that every UN peacekeeping mission or every UN endeavor on human rights is done in conjunction with the AU. You need to hear an African voice. If you don't have an African voice, I'm afraid that any external intervention on those issues is seen, and not always wrongly, with a lot of suspicion. That was just a bit on my experience in Mali dealing with human rights issues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think that ties beautifully to what you said in the beginning, Meredith, if you would like to make a brief comment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so incredibly true, and so often we make a series of assumptions also around Western application of these norms, and I think we have to work very, very hard to pull back from that. And I think in addition, obviously, Juan, to your point on the African Union, engagement of civil society in the societies in which the conflict finds itself is often such a fertile space for not just looking at the regional perspective on human rights, but the very much rooted in the context of the conflict itself. So what are you really hearing from different groups, from marginalized voices, from women, from youth, and so forth about this? Roots it also into something that is real and practical in terms of the gains that can be made, because it can really be also tied to peace dividends. It can be tied to people's lives getting better in that space, and not some sort of universal space that's in the ether, but something that's really happening practically on the ground. Yeah.
And could I just add a very quick one? One of the things that we do in the Commission on South Sudan is to draw on the African Charter of Human and People's Rights. So instead of starting with the ICCPR and other international treaties, we often begin with the regional instruments. And sometimes come down to the domestic constitutional provisions that makes it far harder to argue against. But I think in conjunction with having a visible partnership with the African Union, just drawing on existing norms, even sub-regional ones, might enhance or at least reduce some of the pushback.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a question about something that, thanks to Google University, I'm somewhat dangerously an expert on, called the Universal Periodic Review, which I'm sure most of our panelists are very versed with. And to ask the question, how is that used as a tool of mediation, if at all it's used, when there are known violators of human rights who undergo universal peer review, but they never seem to be anything approaching mediation, or rather, anything that can suggest that the universal periodic review is a tool that pinpoints where mediation can occur. So my question is really to Mr. Afaku and Mr. Liu. The first one is, how do you reshape peace using this mechanism that I'm sure you're very versed with and the panelists is, to identify areas of mediation? And to Mr. Liu, to the extent that you can, from the standpoint of China, can China commit to refocusing its economic strategies of focus in sub-Saharan Africa and include mediation as part of that model? Thank you.
Barney, would you like to start commenting on the role of the UPR in mediation processes?
The short answer is that I don't think it's used enough. Part of what the practice note produced by the UN is saying that mediators need to be well versed in those architectures for accompaniment and enforcement and encouragement for respect for rights. But it's a very rich process because states have to self-audit and come and present and listen to other people's assessment of how they were doing. And I'll put it out there, this year Afghanistan is coming up for peer review. And I've been talking to some people and saying, why don't you find a creative way of listening to all sides in Afghanistan, including those that may be perpetrating some violations within that context, so that you can have a conversation about how to protect and respect rights better. So I think it's a very important and rich tool, and thank you for raising it. I think we should go back to that mechanism a lot more frequently.
Lou, the second question was addressed to you. Can China refocus its strategy in sub-Saharan Africa to include mediation?
I mean, China has tried to do so, at least by appointing several special envoys to Africa, specifically focusing on conflict and also peace mediation. And I think China can do more, simply put. I think not only that China can right now, because the current state, China perceives the peaceful condition as the precondition for China's investment in the region. I think this is a relatively a more conservative stance, saying that we have to achieve peace and then development. I think what China can do in future might be that how to incorporate some of the peace building and also peace ideas into the existing investment in Africa, to the extent that how the Chinese investment in the region might contribute to the peace-building processes or the mediation effort already in the region. I think there's some thinking that should be put there, and this probably will require some of the more dialogue between China and also the local actors and probably some of the existing international actors in the region. But I've been a strong advocate for China to, in a way, mainstreaming more kind of mediation effort in China's economic activities abroad.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Mohamed Ware. I'm the Deputy Executive Secretary of IGAD, the regional body for the Greater Horn of Africa. But I make these comments on my personal capacity because I want to add on to some of the points covered by the panelists. The first one is the relationship between human rights and mediation from a practical, on-the-ground point of view. I personally have been involved, lived through, worked in conflict areas in the Greater Horn of Africa for over 25 years, and I've seen my share of conflict there. I think it's a big mistake, and the panelists have touched on this, to try to separate the two and to make it into two distinct things. One can say that the main purpose is mediation to stop a conflict, but you cannot or at least it becomes very difficult to try to stop conflicts without addressing human rights. In fact, the way war is conducted with violations and so on and so forth will determine how long and how intensive and how bitter it is. And any person who has done mediation in a serious way will tell you that much of the energy and much of the resources is taken by trying to smooth over and resolve and fix the problems that came not from the root causes of the war itself, but violations during the conduct of the war. In fact,
can you address a question to the panelists?
No, I just wanted to I don't have a question. If that's the rule, then I stop here. I just wanted to make a comment.
Okay, sure. Briefly, yeah. Okay, we have another question, so please.
And then the next point, I believe, and I insist on this. Yes, there are universal human rights, and the panelists have touched on this. In fact, so much so that almost any society has values that can be encoded to conform with any number of international or regional human rights conventions. One example, I do remember encoding the Somali conduct war, the traditional conduct of war to conform with the Geneva Conventions. It can be done to that level. Mm-hmm. So let's not shy away or fear or talk about universal human values as if they are, we all know, a Western thing. No, human values are there.
Thank you very much. I think both Meredith and Barney have touched on that. We have a question in the back, please.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Sharif Ala. I'm from the Curtis Center, Political and Conflict Analyst, and I'm a visiting lecturer at Darmstadt University. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to ask a question to the panel. Of course, human rights violations happen in almost all conflicts. However, it's a spectrum as well of violations where we see a conflict like in Sudan, systematic violation, using rape and sexual violence systematically as target, etc. So how do we balance or have a trade-off between immunity for perpetrators to stop the war versus transitional justice? Because sometimes if the right thing to do is to hold them accountable, however, this doesn't give them an incentive to stop the war. So what is the trade-off? How do we reach a balance that bigger picture, we may have 2, 3, 4 warlords go away with what they did, but in return, hundreds of thousands will be spared the violence and the human rights violations. So what's your take on this? Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Who would like to take one? The tricky question, accountability versus immunity. Eamon, would you like to take the shot?
Well, there is a body of international humanitarian law, and it applies everywhere and in all circumstances. Let me just describe what we did in Colombia. The transitional justice deal basically was that the rank and file combatants got immunity, but those who had command responsibility were required to go before a truth commission, tell what they had done. If they did that, then they went before the transitional justice architecture, where they would be heard and so on. And if they were found guilty and were sentenced, they would not serve time in prison, but they would suffer loss of liberty, confined to their own area, house arrest, whatever. If they didn't tell the truth, then they went before the normal judicial system and were subject to the full rigor of the law. The interesting thing about that was the FARC commanders accepted this at the beginning. There was resistance and reluctance on the part of state actors to accept it. But the last count I had was something like 2,600 army or retired army officers had agreed to go before the Truth Commission and the transitional justice system in order to have their cases dealt with. So that's the trade-off in practice.
Would you like to add?
I think, Sharif, on Sudan right now, this is a real dilemma, right? When you have the two generals prosecuting the war and the violations that are going on both sides. And there are a lot of conversations about what do you give to get them to the table in order to stop the war, in order to rebuild a system with sort of core human rights that obviously the Sudanese people so value. I think one of the things that we need to start doing is thinking a bit more creatively and getting away from the binary of we either give immunity or they won't come to the table, because there are so many different things in between. And I think the Colombia case is a really fantastic example of that. I've spoken to South African colleagues who've talked about things like the various conditions for amnesty that were laid out in the South Africa case. I know, Barney, you and I have talked before about how you sequence these discussions and these processes so that you're not also necessarily painting yourself into a corner of a trade-off that leads to more general impunity right away. There's so many different shades of gray in these spaces, and I think that we all need to think a little bit more creatively about that. I fear a lot on Sudan in particular right now that we're living in a really binary moment for it, and I think that is false. And I think we can find more in between that can create something that can support both pressure and incentives to bring people into talks.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Christoph Littmann, Managing Director of CSSP Berlin Center for Integrative Mediation. I have a question to Mr. Liu, which is not so much related to human rights. I've worked in different contexts where I could read articles about the influence of China on the area, on the conflict dynamics, but I haven't yet collaborated or had a close exchange with Chinese peace mediators on the ground. And you, Mr. Liu, having been on the Community of Practice of EU Peace Mediation on a panel in October, just as a feedback, I learned a lot about you tried to explain the Chinese perspective on peace mediation at that panel in October, and I'm happy that you're here in person. So I was wondering, how's the inclusion of Chinese peace mediation in different international formats, UN, AU, or EU? And is there a Chinese format where the community of practice could be maybe better connected, at least from my perspective, there is still some sort of a gap? And where do you see potential for room for improvement for getting closer as communities of practice, not only EU or UN, but maybe also, you mentioned you were surprised by the good connection and the building of relations between China and Ukraine, but there was more tensions even with the European partners. So building on that, where do you see room for improvement of getting together as a community of practice regarding Chinese peace mediation and different international formats already existing? Thank you.
Right, thank you very much for that. I mean, there are Chinese peace mediators, mainly from the foreign ministry, so that is more on the track one. So I don't think that is the part you're discussing here. You're probably talking about, in a way, non-governmental officials doing mediation. And I think the community right now is growing, and the people who are forming these networks of mediation, I think the first group might be people like me who have done research in the region, who have probably in touch with some of the existing mediation groups, right? The second category might be the Chinese people living in the region for a very long time. You find a large number of Chinese diaspora groups, many of them in conflict zones. So they have very deeply rooted local networks, which will help them to navigate their business or their activities in the region. But when it comes to conflict, they also become sometimes the key mediators in the local conflict. So those are the two, in a way, general categories that I can find nowadays. I mean, there's a growing category that sometimes, very interesting enough, is that like some of the business leaders in the region, they have access to the high-level politicians and also armed groups in the country. So sometimes we do find, like business leaders from China, probably reluctantly become the person to go to when there's a need for the Chinese participation in some of the conflict mediation scenarios. So that gave you, in a way, a sketch about the growing networks of the Chinese mediators, so to speak. And I think our current work is trying to establish a more formalized center in China besides the governmental networks to do more mediations in connection with non-governmental mediator groups in Europe and also in other parts of the world. And the emphasis will be more on the field visit and also field trips to establish direct channels with conflicting parties in the region. And the comparative advantage is that there are many groups. I don't think the Chinese government can be in touch directly by themselves. So that leaves the space, I think, for us, in a way, to engage and also to approach.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we've reached the end of our panel. That allows me to say thank you to the wonderful panelists for sharing their expertise and their insights, and I think they will be around if you want to follow up bilaterally with them. And at 3:30, we'll have the next panel focusing on peace and protest. Thank you very much for being here.